There was a young man named Austin who had recently graduated from college. He loved to travel, and he had decided that he would go out on a world tour the same night of his graduation ceremony. Austin traveled to exotic countries and spent many nights at each location. Austin also had a habit of wooing girls whenever he went to a new place. Every time the relationships would start to progress, Austin would pack his bags and get going to the next destination. "My parents are inside. They want to meet you." All right. "I want to spend my whole life with you." "Me too, babe." "Good morning, darling." "Good morning, sweetheart." He also had a hobby of noting down the specialty of each of his visits, but soon he grew bored of the usual holiday destinations. Austin wanted to visit a place that would be more thrilling, but he had practically roamed all over the continents. At last, he decided to head back home and spend a few months with his family. When Austin got back home, he spent hours sharing his experience with his relatives. The moment his mother saw him, she said, "You know what's surprising is that he hasn't brought anyone along. Or have you, Austin? Is there a girl waiting outside?" His family looked through all of his pictures. "So where are you headed off to next?" "I think I'm gonna stay here in the US, at home sweet home, for a while." But after a few days of sitting back at home, he couldn't bear the boredom anymore. He wasn't used to the peace and quiet. He wanted to get out, take a hike, climb a mountain, and meet random people, not to mention girls, and have to find his way back home. He wanted adventure. He mentioned it to a couple of his friends who told him there was no better place to visit than the American countryside. There were breathtaking places he couldn't ever imagine right here at home. "I went over to California last year. I had the time of my life. You'll get to meet some great people, and best of all, you will love the wilderness of the desert, and the cold nights are going to make it even more exciting." When I came back home from my trip, my life had absolutely shifted. I got to learn a whole new way of living out in the heat of the desert. I met some very skilled people. I got to experience what real survival is. Austin was impressed, and he had never gone on a survival trip before, and he thought California was a great place to start. He would hike the mountains or camp out in the wilderness of the desert, and to top it all off, he'd spend a few romantic nights by the seaside with yet another girl before heading back home again. The next day, he booked a flight to California. When he landed there, he grabbed his small backpack and stepped out of the plane and took in the fresh, warm air. He had only brought a few pair of clothes, a flask of water, and some shades with him. He had landed in the busiest of airports, but Austin hadn't planned to stay very long in the hustle and bustle of the huge, crowded city. He was eager to explore the mountain ranges, hills, and valleys of the vast countryside. Austin had an idea that would surely turn this trip into an interesting, memorable experience he could share with everyone over and over again. He hung his small backpack on his shoulders and randomly hopped onto a bus without checking where it was headed to. Without knowing where he was going, made him feel like he was taking a mysterious tour around California. Every time the bus would reach its last stop, he would get off and wait for another random bus and hop on. He didn't know, he didn't care, and he couldn't wait to see where the bus would take him. After a week, Austin found himself traveling around some of the most remote regions of the state out in the Sonoran Desert. He was spending time in an area that tourists seldom visited. The roads were dusty and the houses were small and remote. He felt the dryness and the heat of the desert valley. Not many people lived there in this small desert city. Austin was delighted to be passing through the small towns and having the opportunity to see how these people really lived. He realized that surviving out there was no joke. There was no electricity, running water, or sewage. No one came to the town to collect trash, but it was definitely home to its residents, who made their own library, cafe, and small shops and diners. He met a few people and observed how they lived. They used solar panels for electricity, and they got their water from a neighboring small town. One day, he found himself traveling on yet another bus, passing through yet another remote area. When the bus set off, it was nearly empty, but after about 10 stops, a large crowd of people got on. and it was filled to its capacity. After a while, Austin noticed that the other passengers were eyeing him strangely. Austin thought it was because he wasn't from the area. He dressed differently, but he found it odd that they all chose to stand instead of sit down in the vacant seat next to him. At the next stop, a young woman boarded the bus. Austin watched as she swiped her card. She didn't have that stern expression on her face like the rest of the people on the bus. She walked down the aisle and looked around. At last, she sat down a seat away from Austin. Austin peered at her from the corner of his eye, thinking of his best pickup line to use on the girl. Suddenly, he felt a nudge on his arm. He turned to see the young woman looking at him with wide brown eyes. She said, "Do you know where this bus is going?" Austin gave a polite smile and chuckled. "I have no idea. I'm just roaming around getting to know the place. I got on the bus without looking at the destination." The young woman then leaned closer and whispered, "Well, then I must warn you, it's not a safe place out here in the Californian desert." Austin raised his brow and asked, "Why?" The young woman said, "The next stop is the last stop on the bus, and it will drop us off in a small town that has a very bad reputation. There are people there who prey on tourists who are lost. I don't live here, and I have to cross over the town to get back home from work. People say these townspeople barely ever have food or supplies. I've heard this and that, and even I wonder how these people have survived all this time." Austin looked at the young woman, who seemed to be a little worried, and it was obvious that she didn't like being amongst the local people on the bus. Austin didn't pay heed to what she said, but he humored her. He said, "Well, I'll get to know the story when I get there. It will be a great adventure." The young woman frowned and said, "If you were wise, you would take heed to what I tell you. Everyone in the neighboring towns talk about horrible tales of what goes on in this town. You won't be able to bear them if I told you." Austin started to become a little curious, but it only interested him further into stopping to explore the town. "If you're afraid, I can accompany you to your home, if that's what you want." The young woman folded her arms and said, "You don't believe me. Just look around and see the people around you. They're all from this town." Austin took a quick glance around the other passengers. They all stared at him. They looked thirsty, and Austin even heard someone's belly rumble. They took big gulps and wetted their lips. Austin began to feel a little uneasy with all the eyes on him. Just then, the bus began to slow down as it ascended a steep, hilly road. "Hear me, this is our chance. There's a narrow road up ahead that leads to my town. I usually take this bus and go out the emergency exit here. I can help you get to safety if you wish." Austin broke into a cold sweat. "I don't know." The young woman stared at Austin's confused face and grabbed his hand. "Let's go." She walked to the back of the bus with Austin behind her. She quickly pulled the emergency exit and jumped out. Austin took his backpack in his arms and leaped through the narrow opening. Austin saw the young woman head off onto the small road. Austin crashed onto the dirt road and rolled over to pick himself up. He saw the young woman smiling at him and waving her hand. He thought to himself, this was turning out to be one adventure worth sharing after all, even if his life was in danger. The bus had gone a distance ahead and suddenly halted. Austin sat up on the ground and looked back. The townspeople started coming off the bus in the middle of the road. One of them said, "Look, there he is!" The man pointed to Austin, and a group of people came running his way. In a panic, Austin got up on his feet and looked for the young woman. She was running down the road, and she looked back and gestured him to run and follow her. Austin ran for his life and followed her. She crossed over a ditch and continued running. Austin also jumped over and continued her way. Suddenly, she tripped on something and fell to the ground. She injured her knee. Austin went to help her, but before he could lend her a hand, she got herself up. She teared a portion of her dress and tied it around her knee. Austin could start hearing the passengers of the bus coming their way. They were yelling and shouting as they stampeded down the path. The young woman panted, and she warned Austin, "They're going to spot us anytime soon. We have to get out of here." The two fled for their lives, scrambling down the steep road. "Wait, I think we can mislead them. I see some shrubbery there. Let's hide behind it until they pass by us." The two crunched down behind the shrubs. Austin whispered to the young woman, "What do you think they want?" The young woman looked at him with an anxious face and said, "They want to make us their meals. They want to survive off of us." Austin watched the crowd run down the road. They soon gave up their chase, and one by one they all returned to the main road. Austin leaned back on his elbows on the ground and stretched his feet out. He was exhausted, but at the same time, he was overjoyed that he managed to escape the clutches of these ravenous, psychotic people. Catching his breath, he smiled at the young woman and said, "Thanks. I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't met you today." He watched the young woman laugh softly as she sat on a boulder in front of him and crossed her legs. A breeze blew her hair back. Austin felt deeply grateful to her. He would always remember this experience, and he would never forget the beautiful moment he was having now as he stared at her. He couldn't understand how he would repay her for saving him. The young woman couldn't stop laughing. She smiled and seemed delighted. There was a twinkle in her eye. Austin sat next to her, leaned towards her, and brushed a lock of her hair behind her ear. "You look beautiful when you laugh. What's so funny?" he said with a smile. The young woman swooped down and picked up a large rock. She played with it in her hand and chuckled softly and said, "Now I can eat alone." Click on the subscribe button and check out more awesome videos on our channel. And don't forget to press the bell icon because you know it's interesting.